John Garcia, I hope you're having a great day. Welcome into the game in T-Town.
I'm doing well, Ryan. I'm curious to know what it's been like over there today.
Meltdown. I mean, well, to kind of put this into perspective, we had to clear a line to get you on because of the phone lines have been literally jammed up. You're our first guest. I mean,
I'm honored. I will say that. Never a dull moment.
John, can I get your thoughts on the article? I mean, do you have any opinions? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I spoke to Ryan Hurts a lot leading up to Jalen's enrollment at Alabama. Jalen kind of handled things the way he does now. He didn't really enjoy the recruiting process from a media perspective. Really, the only interview he did about committing to Alabama was with our guys because they were there at the airport getting ready for the Elite 11. He didn't even want to tweet out his commitment. He gave his phone to the Elite 11 counselors to tweet out his Alabama commitment. He thought it was that little of a deal. So he's never really dealt with the media or leading into his college career. So his father and also obviously his high school coach kind of handled it for him. And he was really insightful about those things. So I thought this was a little out of character just based on the small sample size of a variant that I had. I would be lying if I said I did not communicate with him today after seeing that article. I don't want to get into much of that, but I'll say that there's still a lack of clarity on what he was trying to convey and what was posted. So that's a problem we see a lot nowadays. I don't know the whole context, but it's mighty interesting. It doesn't feel quite like the Blake Barnett situation, which I'm sure has popped up on your air. But it's interesting. Obviously, this is something that is not going to go away, and it's something like many I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see how Nick Saban dismisses it, because I doubt he'll answer anything about it, but I'm curious to see his method of dismissal this time around. It's a very interesting story that is a long ways away from being true or false, right? I mean, even if everything was 100% true or the opposite, we won't know until August or September. So that leaves a lot of room for conversation, potential distraction, what have you. So the timing of it, I think, is a little odd, other than the fact that, Jalen's going to take all the first-team reps on A Day and have this big kind of showcase on Saturday. Not that he needs it, but he'll have it. So that is the only, intrigue with the timing. Everything else seems a little bit off to me. But again, that's without knowing every element of what actually was said or what was the goal for each side there.
But, John, is it fair to say that there's an opportunity for Jalen Hurts to silence all these critics? Because the last thought we have of Jalen is standing on the sideline supporting his teammate for winning the championship in that second half and really having a bad performance in the first half. Is it now fair to say that there's an opportunity in front of Jalen that he could silence a lot of those critics?
Yeah, and he's had this opportunity, from the moment the clock hit zero internally. And that's obviously really what matters with this whole thing. No battle is won or lost from the year prior. I mean, heck, if you believe what Nick Saban says, there's no battle that carries over for even multi-year starts. There's nothing that carries over into the next year. So the beginning of 2018 is now in terms of football. So there's always been an opportunity. It's an enhanced opportunity with the injury to Tua Tagovailoa, and it is now going to be somehow. We didn't think this could be more, accepted and kind of focused in on, but now it is with this coming out. So he's always had the opportunity. It's now just as hyperly focused from all angles as humanly possible, which is something that is not surprising on its own, but he can certainly go out there and show some improvement. But it's not easy. As the article mentioned, this is another new offensive coordinator, not just for Jalen, but for everybody. So it's quite the unique story. But he does have the opportunity to kind of do what all the gifts of Jalen, point out, brush some dirt off his shoulders, hold up the index finger and shush a few people or a few critics. But I don't think he's going to try to do something outside of his normal realm just for that. I think if he does something different it'll be on his own merit and something that is going to be the product of whatever work or additional work he's put in to identify an area for improvement.
John, you've been inside that locker room. You played college ball. Do you think this will be a story in that locker room among the players? Because that's really what matters. I mean, it's what matters what Nick Saban thinks. It really doesn't matter what we think. We have an opinion. Certainly, we try to share that. We invite people to share their opinions via the social networks or phone calls. But do you think inside that locker room, this will be a story that will get any traction?
Not so much in the springtime. I think towards the end of the regular season of 2017 into the college football playoff, it was much more of a, dialogue from what I'm told internally there amongst the players in the locker room, in the meeting rooms, what have you. But in the spring, I do believe, even though there's collective youth on the roster, I do believe there's a certain element of reset that goes down each spring. For those who played college football, spring really is. It's like an entirely new team. It's an entirely new feel. Everything, all the dynamics are tweaked a little bit because of all the turnover on the coaching staff, all the turnover on the player roster, all of that. So if that is true, which is something I do believe is true, I don't think it resonates right now. Now, if it's July, August, then if it feels the same as it does today, then it could definitely creep into a locker room, and the locker room would know which quarterback they feel best with. And it's not something that is tangible. It's kind of a feel. It's not anything that you don't take a player vote or anything like that, but every team has a feel when a certain quarterback or certain leader is out there. You hear, the common phrase is, it's this person's team, right? So 2 years ago, it became Jalen's team. Towards the end of last year, there was a little question mark at the end of that sentence. So I don't know how much of that will carry over because it is such a different team. But if it does carry over, I don't anticipate it being an issue today.
John, as we walk into Bryant-Denny Stadium, and we're going to work our way to recruiting, I promise you, coming up in a couple seconds. But as we walk into Bryant-Denny Stadium on Saturday, other than the quarterbacks, anything else grab your attention? I know from a former defensive back perspective, that's where you're going to be glued in. Anything there that grabs you as we walk into Bryant-Denny Stadium on Saturday?
Yeah, the secondary has got to be it. Offensive line is going to be interesting. Defensive line will be interesting. I think receivers and running backs they are what they are, which is a good thing. But that secondary is the biggest question mark. Minimal experience returning. Everybody feels great about Deontay Thompson, but even he alone is a fairly inexperienced player, especially when you compare it to some of the guys Bama's had coming back each of the years. Even during those campaigns where Bama did lose a lot of NFL guys, it seemed like there was always one or two guys coming back to kind of get that torch passed to them, something that we see more maybe on this team at the linebacker position. Well, it's usually there in the secondary as well, but there's no clear guy right now, at least from where we sit. So I think the natural progression up to that point will be extremely interesting at safety and corner as well. There's going to be a lot of new blood and new faces. Savion Smith maybe leading that charge. So the entire secondary to me is pretty fascinating, but this is the time of year where guys usually emerge and kind of step up. I remember, I think it was A-Day, last year or 2 years ago even, where Trevon Diggs kind of came out of nowhere and was doing all these things to get people excited, and he ended up starting last year. So A-Day for positions like that, where the defense is typically ahead of the offense anyway, the secondary can really give us a good glimpse as to who may be the front runners for a lot of open starting positions.
A couple of days ago, Nick Saban was at an event, and he talked about that youth at secondary and said that we're going to have to count on the guys that will be arriving at the University of Alabama. They're going to have an opportunity to play. Let me go and just ask you on the spot, on the 2018 class that's already signed that will be enrolling here in that first summer session, if you were betting on one guy that could make a contribution in that secondary in this class, who would it be?
I hate to go with chalk, but it's got to be Patrick Surtain Jr. I mean, he's one of the best cornerbacks I've ever scouted. He's got basically everything you look for in the modern cornerback. 6'2", good enough speed, good hits, physical, and technical, which is typically the term that we don't say about those incoming freshmen. Usually that's the area where there's the biggest need. It's that mental side of the game, maintaining your leverage, knowing when to take chances, things like that. But Pat has shown it at every event he's ever been to. We all know his father was a multi-year Pro Bowler, and that certainly doesn't hurt. But he's got all the tools. I mean, I think if he would have enrolled in January, I think he would have been one of the top 2 or 3 defensive stars in all of spring ball, and certainly a top emerger. So I think he'll be late.
Let me go into this weekend's list of visitors. How big of a weekend is it for the Crimson Tide?
As big of an A-Day as we've covered from a recruiting perspective, and that obviously is a pretty big deal. A-Day is always kind of an apex of the spring recruiting period. It's like the in-between of getting kids on campus versus the staff going out and seeing kids on their own. And this group is strong, multiple 5 stars, including a ton of commitments. Some of the flag bearers for the class, Pierce Quick, Paul Tyson, they'll be back on campus, so that'll enable some peer-on-peer recruiting. And then other 5 stars, number 1 player in the state, Clay Webb, the number 1 player in the following year in state, Jason Jones, all expected on campus. A couple other interesting 5 stars, Darnell Wright, big offensive tackle out of Huntington, West Virginia. So not just about those in-state offensive linemen, although that will be the focus for the Tide in this 2019 class. And then one of the guys who's been really up and down with Alabama, the number 1 defensive tackle in the country, Ishmael Sopsher, out of Amite, Louisiana, if that sounds familiar, same school, same hometown as Devontae Smith. And there's multiple Alabama targets on that roster, both of them very familiar with Devontae. So you wonder how much he becomes a bit of a recruiter with those guys in town this year. We know Bama always wants big linemen, and there's 5 stars on both sides of the ball coming to Tuscaloosa for A-Day. A bevy of additional prospects. Most of the top prospects, committed or otherwise in state, should be on campus. Again, there's not a lot of spring game competition. You know, I think a lot of years Alabama and Auburn have it on the same day, so there's a lot of pull each direction. Well, this year Auburn had theirs a couple weeks ago, so it's really just Bama, LSU, Tennessee, Georgia. Those are really the main southeastern spring games, and most of the elite prospects at this point are expected in Tuscaloosa compared to those others. So in-state and out, it should be a pretty big day for Alabama. I'd be pretty surprised if there weren't multiple additions to the classes of 2019 and maybe 2020 as well. Never too early to jump on board with that next class. So it should be a pretty big Saturday, both on and off the field at Alabama.
John, are you already shocked that when we look at 8 commitments so far, there's already a lot of defensive backs? I guess more than half the class is defensive backs in this 2019 class so far.
Not shocked that it's a priority and more safeties than corners, which makes sense because, like we talked about with Pat Surtain and these other guys, a lot of corners brought in last cycle, so naturally a lot of safeties. I think the key will be, you know, which ones do you hold on to? I think both of the safeties that are committed and expected on Saturday, Brendan Gant from Florida, Brandon Turnage from Mississippi, both of them extremely coveted. Obviously, they're at out-of-state programs, out-of-state schools. Will be all over these guys. Their in-state schools, if you will, are already all over them. So I think there's a legitimate chance that one or both of them doesn't end up signing with Alabama. I think that's going to be a theme in this class. Last year, everything was about being methodical and very selective and overcoming all of these obstacles against Alabama with a smaller class and all this coaching transition. Well, this class will be the opposite. I think they'll be a little less selective, which means you're going to see a little bit more turnover on that commitment list. But when you can sign 25 plus, like Alabama can, you afford yourself a little bit of that flexibility. And this is the time of year where things begin to separate with all of these visits, with coaches able to evaluate these kids in person ahead of camp season, which is kids going to these schools to compete themselves. So you'll see a lot of movement here, plus and minus, I think, on this Alabama commitment list. But when it comes to DBs, more safeties than corners, which is why I think the latest cornerback commitment, in-state corner Christian Williams, number 1 defensive back in the state, was pretty big for Bama. If you lock him in, you can kind of focus on safeties elsewhere with or without movement on that commitment list.